Chapter 20. There was a new urgency in Silathen's manner as the outriders closed in response to his signal. He looked around the foreigners, ensuring they were all wearing the keffeyehs he had given them as they set out for Al-Shabaab. These were desert headdresses, essentially simple squares of cotton folded into a triangle, then draped over the head so that the elongated tails hung down either side and the back, providing protection from the sun. They were held in place by a twisted coil of camel hair rope. Now, he quickly showed them how the elongated tails could be pulled across the face, then quickly fastened to each other to cover the nose and mouth. It was a simple but effective form of head protection in the desert. "You'll need them," he said. "Once the sand wall hits us, you'll be unable to breathe without them." Will glanced to the south. The thin, dark line he had noticed a few minutes ago was now a thick band that spread from one side of the horizon to the other. In fact, he realized, the southern horizon seemed to have moved closer. He glanced north to confirm the fact, then back again. The sandstorm was blotting out the horizon to the south. It was a dirty brown color, at the base almost black, and now he could see that it towered thousands of meters into the air, blocking out the sky. The storm itself was rapidly becoming the boundary of their world. Sulla then stood up in his stirrups, looking for any available shelter. "There," he called. "There's a shallow wadi. The bank will give us a little protection." He urged his horse toward the wadi, a dry gully that cut through the rocky, hard ground. The walls were barely 3 meters in height, but they would offer some protection at least. They hurried and followed him. He halted a few meters short of the edge to allow them to pass by. "My God," said Horace, "look how fast it's moving." They looked up. The dirty brown wall of swirling sand now completely blocked out their sight to the south. There was nothing but the storm, and it was quickly advancing on them. It was moving like the wind, Will thought. Then he realized it was the wind. He glanced up and caught Evelyn's eyes on him. They exchanged a worried look, and he knew that they were both thinking of the same thing. The massive storm that had swept them out when they were prisoners on Wolfwind years before. He tried to grin reassuringly at her, but at that moment, his first breath of the storm struck them, unbelievably hot, and fetid and laden with flying invisible grains of sand. Tug plunged nervously as the wind whipped his face and flanks. Will kept a firm hand on his reins. Usually, Tug only needed him to hold tightly, but in these conditions he knew the horse would respond better to a sense of control, and firm pressure on the bit would impart on him. "Take it easy, boy," he said. "It's just sand." The wind was now a living presence around them, keening horribly, and the light was dying. Will was startled to find that Evelyn, less than a few meters away, was now a shadowy, indistinct form in the dimness. The others were no clearer. Sulla then rode among them, and they pressed closer to him to hear him, horses tossing and whinnying nervously. He unwound the protective keffeyeh from his mouth and shouted his instructions. "Ride down to the wadi, dismount, and turn your horses' tails to the wind. Try to cover their heads with your cloaks if you can." Then whatever he was going to add was lost in a giant fit of coughing as he drew in a mouthful of flying sand. He doubled over, pulling his headdress across his face again and waving them toward the wadi. Halt led the way. Will's sense of panic rose as he realized that his mentor would be out of sight in a few meters if he didn't hurry to follow him. He was conscious of the other blurred figures close to him, as Gillen, Horace, Evelyn, and Svengal all followed suit. Further away were very vague forms moving in the storm, and he realized these were the Iridi troops moving to the shelter. The dim shadow that was Halt and Abelard seemed to sink into the ground, and he realized that they must have reached the rim of the wadi. Tug, seeing them disappear, became nervous, sensing that the ground before him was unsafe. He whinnied shrilly and balked, resisting Will's efforts to urge him forward. The wind was screaming around them, terrifying in its intensity and power, disorienting the little horse. Never before had Tug refused Will's command, but now he stood his ground, the wind preventing his hearing the reassuring tones of his trusted master's voice as he sensed danger somewhere ahead. He had seen Halt and Abelard disappear, and he was trained to protect his master in situations like this. He braced his forelegs and stood fast, head down into the screaming, flaying wind. Will saw the shadowy figure of Horace move past him, recognizable only because the fact that Kicker stood hands taller than Tug. Someone else moved past too. He had no idea who it was. Conditions were getting worse. As unbelievable as it might seem, the wind was like a blast from an oven. The air superheated, and millions of flying, stinging sand particles tore at any piece of exposed skin. The grains forced their way into clothing, under the face mask of the keffeyehs, into boots, inside collars, and into any crevice of the skin. Eyelids, ears, nostrils were full of it, and Will coughed rackingly. He found the action of coughing caused him to inhale more sand than he expelled, but it was unavoidable. He couldn't stay here like this, he realized, and he couldn't leave Tug. He would have to dismount and lead him, hoping that the sight of his master would calm his fears enough for him to move. He took a firm grip on the reins and swung down onto the ground. Ordinarily, he would have trusted Tug to stand still when he dismounted, but he knew the horse was close to panic in his screaming, hellish, sand-laden wind. He slipped his right arm up under Tug's neck, caressing him and speaking to him all the time, keeping a firm hold on the reins with the other. It seemed to be working. Tug's braced forefeet relaxed, and he allowed himself to take a faltering few steps in response to Tug's urging. "Come on, boy. It's all right. It's only sand." He tried to croon, but the words reassuringly. But he was startled by the sound of his own voice, which came out as a dry, faltering croak. He doubted that the horse could hear him, but he felt that the contact of his right arm and the proximity of his body was keeping the little horse under control. He stooped and led Tug forward, trying to see the point where the ground dropped away into the wadi. It was all he could do to make out the ground itself amid the flying debris of the storm. He glanced up at Tug's face. The little horse's eyes were shut tight against the wind. Fine sand and dust had crusted over the moisture around the eye sockets and lids. Where in the blazes was that bank? He stumbled forward awkwardly with the resistant weight of Tug's body. He pulled the reins firmly, and the horse yielded a little, taking 3 more hesitant steps forward. He realized that Tug's instinct was to turn his tail toward the wind, protecting his eyes and nostrils from the whipping sand. But he had to keep forcing the little horse forward to the meager shelter offered by the wadi's banks. He had a sense that the storm had not reached its peak. Sand whipped across his eyes, blinding him. Then he released his hold around Tug's neck for a moment to try and wipe them clear. It was a futile effort. He gasped and sputtered, suffocated by the storm. He pulled on the reins once more and stepped forward, head bowed against the screaming darkness around him. Then he felt his foot fall into empty space. Off balance, he teetered on the brink of the wadi bank, flailing his free arm in the air, trying to regain his stance. His whirling arm struck Tug across the nose, and the little horse reared back in surprise and alarm. The reins came loose from Will's grip as Tug jerked away. He wheeled instinctively away from the wind. His senses, normally so keen and finely honed, were deadened by the all-pervading scream of the storm. Seeking for some sense of Will, he took a pace, then another, whinnying shrilly in alarm. But he was heading in the wrong direction. Will floundered to his feet, tried to call to his horse, but the voice was barely a croak by now. He thought. He could sense a presence in the storm a few meters away. He stumbled towards it, knowing it was Tug, but the vague shape, nothing more than half-perceived denser mass of darkness surrounding him, moved away, and he lost sight of it. He stumbled forward, the wind behind him now. "Tug!" he tried to shout, but the sound was inaudible even to his own ears, drowned by the triumphant shriek of the massive wind. He stretched out a hand and touched nothing but flying sand. Then, miraculously, he saw a shadow looming out of the dark mass of the wind, sand and debris. "Tug!" he gasped, but a hand grabbed the collar of his cloak and pulled him forward. Dimly, he realized that he was face to face with Selden. "Get down!" the Wakir shouted at him, dragging him toward the rough ground. Will fought against the iron grip. "Horse," he managed to force out. "My horse." "Leave him." Sulla then spoke slowly and deliberately so that he could be heard above the storm. Now he was urging his own horse, trained and accustomed to these conditions, to its knees, all the time holding Will's collar with his free hand. The Aridi horse lay on its side, head curled around into the shelter of its own body. Will felt a foot slip between his feet and trip him so that he and Sulla then crashed to the ground together, the Aridi dragging him into the scant shelter provided by the horse's body. "Tug!" Will screamed, the effort searing his parched throat. In agony, Sulla then was fumbling with his cloak, trying to drag it over both their heads to protect them from the sand. He leaned over to speak directly into Will's ear. "You'll die out there," he shouted. "He's gone. Understand?" Dully, Will realized he was right. He would have no chance of finding his horse in the whirling, brown mass that surrounded them. He felt a great stab of pain in his heart at the thought of his horse, alone and terrified in all that horror. Then he sobbed uncontrollably, great racking sobs that heaved and shuddered through his entire body. But there were no tears. The heat and the choking sand and dust denied him even that small comfort.